pleasure to have Professor Audrey Truschke with us. As all of you know that and her work on South Asian history, let me just briefly introduce about the works of Professor Audrey. She's teaching at Rutgers, New Jersey, as Associate Professor of South Asian History. And before she wrote two very wonderful research or review works, Culture of Encounters, Sanskrit at a Mughal Court, and the second one, which we conducted last time as a session, Aurangzeb, the Man and a Myth. But this is a book that was released recently, but from the preface, I came to know that it was years of the research and it was interrupted in between, I think, due to the previous account. And she had worked hard and bring out some of the facts and the research. So before going to the book itself, to the title and other, I would like to recite, if you allow me, a verse from which it started, the Faiz Ahmad Faiz. Bol ke sach zinda hai ab tak, bol jo kuch kehna hai keh le. Speak, the truth is still alive. Speak, say what you have to say. So, Audrey, going to the title, The Language of the History, Sanskrit Narratives of Muslim Past was, I think, published by Penguin in India in January 2021. So you did a chronological review that gave a deep insights of the socio-cultural, political, and religious identities of almost, I think, a time span of 6 centuries. And more than that, because the first chapter is about, we'll go in detail on that. First chapter is talking about from 8th century to 12th century also. So you build upon reviews and busted some of the myths and modern era narratives. So let's quickly give us the overview how the journey and the writing of this title was started and what is all about this. Thank you, Audrey.
Thank you so much for that very kind introduction. And thanks for having me here. It's always a pleasure to talk with you guys. So how the project came about, you sort of hinted at it, but let me tell the slightly fuller story. So I intended to research and write the language of history as my second book after Culture of Encounters. And then Aurangzeb came along and caused problems, as he generally does, right? Even death seemingly can't stop that guy from creating issues in our lives today. So the opportunity to write Aurangzeb came along. I seized it. I researched, wrote, and dealt with the aftermath of having produced that historical biography. And then I turned back to the language of history. Let me just talk, very briefly about some of the key points that I make in the book and some of the challenges that I try to issue as well. So one of the core arguments of the book, really, if you were going to identify one, probably the core argument of the book, is that there is history writing in Sanskrit. The idea that there is no written history in Sanskrit is an idea that persists today. Many people think that Sanskrit literature boasted every genre under the sun, beautiful poetry and plays and literature and satire and all this great stuff, but somehow they missed the history boat. And I think that that's not true. And I argue in the book that it is we who are mistaken, that we have been looking for history in the wrong places and we have been defining it the wrong way. I argue that the texts that I use that talk about real events and real people, and primarily political events and people, they're not hagiography. It's not pseudo-history. It's not half history. It's not or any other form of sort of non-history, right? People have tried to describe these works with a whole bunch of terms that basically put them outside of the bounds of history. And I argue that instead, it's actually these works together constitute a parallel archive that we can use to access both Sanskrit intellectual history and Indo-Persian rule, and that we fail to use this archive to our detriment. Now, one second argument that I make in the book, and specifically defining the sort of history that pre-modern Sanskrit intellectuals wrote, I argue that they wrote history as poetry. And this is not to say, it's not that there were two separate realms and they somehow mixed them together. It's not that they downgraded history by introducing literary conventions. It is that the way that you wrote the past and brought it alive for readers was through poetry. And honestly, I think that that's not all that different from what we do today. Many modern historians like to think that our discipline is based on this almost scientific basis. And I want to be clear that I am a modern historian, and I am as attached to facts and historical truth as any modern historian. In fact, I'm actually more attached to those things because of the pressure of Hindu nationalism on me and others in my field. That said, history is all the words between the names and the dates, right? History is the narrative, not the facts. A list of facts is called a timeline. A book that I write that we would call history, right? That's the story. And for us as modern historians, it should be a truthful story, right? Where we have very strong commitments to trying to recover history accurately, but it is narrative nonetheless. And so I really try to get at the book how we can use and read literary devices and conventions in order to get at the historical truth for pre-modern Sanskrit intellectuals. The last sort of major argument that I'll mention that I make throughout the book has to do with Sanskrit views of the Muslim other. And this is a key question that I went into the book with. We look back at the second millennium CE in India, and we say that the coming of Indo-Persian rule and the sort of set of associated cultural, social, and religious changes, that this was sort of the biggest, kind of set of shifts in that 1,000-year period. What did people who lived through it think about it, right? That was a key question for me. And I want to be clear that I did not pose this question for sort of like all Indians, okay? This is not a book about popular history. This is a book about elite history. I specifically wanted to know what India's traditional learned elite who worked and wrote in Sanskrit thought about Indo-Muslim rule and the people who enacted it. And what I found pretty quickly was that there was very strong interest in this. Many scholars today think that Sanskrit intellectuals had nothing to say about Islam, and that is ridiculous. Sanskrit intellectuals had pretty limited interest in Islamic theology, but they were really interested in Muslim peoples, especially those who were instituting and enacting political power over parts of South Asia. But I also found while they had this strong interest, for Sanskrit intellectuals, the Muslim other was not particularly Muslim, and usually not all that other either, right? So at the end of the day, my question was actually not a very good one. It was not a well worded question, and so as I go through the text and I go more or less chronologically in the book, I try to recover and kind of richly describe what specific intellectuals, Jayanaka and Ganga Devi and Srivara and Lakshmipati and so forth, what they thought about and how they defined the people about whom they were writing, right? If they didn't see them as Muslim and other, well, then how did they see them? And there's not a single answer, and the rich diversity of views is a sort of constant thesis throughout the book. Let me just sort of close my opening comments here with just a couple of thoughts about kind of modern challenges that this issues us. Obviously, I think that there's a lot in terms of rethinking Sanskrit intellectual history and Indo-Persian rule, and particularly history writing during Indo-Persian rule. But I think there are also payouts for those more interested in modern times. So one, I hope that the book contributes to a ongoing and at this point, long-standing scholarly effort to rethink the nature of identities in pre-modern India. And this is a project that, it started far before me and will probably continue far, far after my scholarship. But I hope that the book is sort of one more, something else that we can sort of throw into that mix. We think today about Hinduism and Islam, and these categories just were not the operative ones for the people in text that I was working on. And I hope that specifically by introducing alternative terms, right? Not just saying that this stuff didn't really exist in the same way 500 years ago, but hey, here's some other ways that they actually did think about identity, that maybe there's some meat there that might help us pierce and rethink the kind of monolithic nature of modern identities.
So,
sorry. Oh.
Yeah, I just say that that bol ke sach zinda hai ab tak. This is how this verse of Faz is going to fit when you talk about in the modern terms.
Absolutely.
About speaking the truth that is still alive, and you dig it out and you.
No, and that's actually a good place to mention that there are parts of the book that I think some people won't like, right? And I didn't shy away from those. So let me close by just naming two of those. One is that I address women and sexism explicitly in the book, and I address that in both the past and the present. The Sanskrit tradition overall was dominated by men, almost unbelievably dominated by men. And so I do include one woman in the book, and I wish it didn't have to be singular. I wish I could have had more, but you work with what you've got. What I find truly distressing, however, is that this embrace of male dominance is not something that Sanskrit studies has left in the past. It lives on today. And as an academic who lives and works in the United States, I specifically call out the almost unbelievable and the certainly inexcusable sexism of Sanskrit studies of Indology in the United States Academy that has created a very homogenous professoriate of scholars who work on Sanskrit in particular. Another thing that I call out that will resonate perhaps both on sort of in many corners of the world is Brahmanical hegemony. Many of the authors that I discuss are Brahmins, not all of them, okay, but a number of them. And they're really concerned with protecting Brahmanical privilege. That is also not an issue that we have left in the past, although one difference is that today, that tends to be a little bit more finessed and massaged. People aren't quite as open about that prejudice than the text that I'm reading from hundreds of years ago. They are incredibly open about how this was a sort of layered system. They're at the top of the social hierarchy, and they want to preserve that status at almost any cost to anybody else. So I try to call that out. I describe it in unvarnished terms. And again, I point out that this exists in modern times in both a variety of social contexts, but also within Sanskrit studies. Many Sanskrit scholars continue to privilege Brahmanical materials and discount other sorts of materials, specifically by Jain intellectuals. And I do work on a number of Jain works in the book. I do not present them as footnotes. They are not just something to add diversity. Right? Jain intellectuals had as much right to define the pre-modern Sanskrit tradition as Brahmins did.
So you also left some questions, or the research questions, what you say, left open for the future scholarship. Still, maybe you will going to work on that, or any other scholar will come up and find a way to work on this part. So at least I can say that you open a very big and a broader research question for the future research, especially for the linguists and literary historians in that frame of time. Did you say that like that? I understand like that.
Yeah, I certainly, I feel that honestly, I cover about 36 texts in the book. And I feel that I really just scratched the surface of all of them. There's also a number of texts that I don't cover at all. Some of them I mention in the footnotes. There's one or two where I say like, look, probably should have covered this, but I just didn't have time. I really hope another scholar works on them. I also don't work on history writing much before the late 12th century. As you mentioned, I have one chapter for earlier inscriptions, but there are historical narrative texts before the 12th century in Sanskrit, and I don't work on those in this book. So, my dream would be for more scholars to work on historical materials in Sanskrit.
So just a couple of questions touching the essence. We cannot touch the entire treatise. That's a major part of the work. Anybody who want to be interested, he goes to the reading and he has to read it and reflect in his own way. First of all, the very first question, that the binary, what we saw today, the Hindu-Muslim binary in the modern days, was not reflected in this research. And not only for 1 century, for 2 centuries, entire span of centuries, like we say, starting from 8th century and going up to 15th or 16th. We didn't find this sort of binary what existed today in the present terminologies. So this book is going to clarify based on the evidence-based research.
I certainly hope so.
Yeah, exactly. Because if anybody going to read the book, you will not find a single mention of divide in general, like Hindus and Muslims. There were certain identities that Audrey has presented here, like maybe ethnicities, pseudo-ethnicities, as you mentioned many times, sometimes because the terminology they are using, not exactly defining the ethnologies. That's why she used the term pseudo-ethnic terms, but not specifically you will find a term Muslim, Musalman, Hindu, something like that. So early writings starting from 8th to 11th century, we find a term Truschke and Tajika. And specifically, we didn't find a specific Muslim names except for the few places like you talk about Rajputa Grand. At that place, I think you mentioned one specific name. So can you please clarify that these terms Trushka or Tajika were the loose terms? It may define the Arabs, it may define the Turks, sometimes Muslims, sometimes non-Muslims, Central Asians. So it was what they considered as literary historians in their own definitions.
Sure. Okay, so these two terms, Tajika and Turushka, they both come about in the sort of the couple of centuries before Indo-Muslim rule, Indo-Persian rule is instituted, outside of Sindh in northern India. And I call them, as you say, I call them pseudo-ethnic terms. And I really mean both parts of that, both the pseudo and the ethnic. So these are both terms that are not Sanskrit in origin. Okay, they are adaptations of terms from other languages into Sanskrit, which is notable. Sanskrit is generally not a very open language or tradition in terms of importing stuff from outside. It's in theory supposed to be self-contained. So to import an outside term, there had to be a good reason for that. That's not something that just, sort of like happens. All right. And Sanskrit, of course, had a lot of terms for outsiders, people who are different than us. Sanskrit has a huge vocabulary. So it's not like there was a lack of terms if they just wanted a term for like other people. So there had to be something specific, and there had to be a reason to import these terms. If you're familiar at all with the Perso-Arabic tradition, you know that Turk and Tajiks, like those are specific categories and remain so for centuries after this, right? I mean, even in Mughal writings, you're going to find specificity there. But basically, I could find really I could identify no moment when the specificity of these terms was limited to their ethnic meaning in the original languages. And by that, I mean specifically Turushka does continue to be used for at least a few centuries for both Muslims of any ethnic background, as well as Turks, whether they're Muslim or not. And this gets confusing because then in early texts, this comes up in Kalhana's Raja Turangini, which is the most famous text that I work on in the book. So he has a couple of passages where he talks about Turushkas, and I honestly don't know whether he's talking about Muslims or not. And part of why I don't know is because there is no specific way of talking about Muslims in this period, even in the terminology, right? Turushka can be used for Muslims or non-Muslims, right? So you get a sense, even in the mid-12th century, about how there was just a lack of specificity. Describing Muslims as different was not a priority. So the terms are brought in. I think there has to be some meaning or content to them being ethnic terms, but then they're not used in any specific ethnic way. So that's sort of how we get to pseudo-ethnic. Over the centuries, they become sort of part of a fairly wide set of vocabulary that is used by different authors for Muslims. And I would say there are three terms that occur more commonly than others. And those are going to be Malaysia, Turushka, Yavana.
Yavana, yes, exactly.
Notably, all three of those terms also continue to be used for non-Muslims, right? So it's not exclusive, right? Like a Malaysia can be any sort of outcast person. We already talked about Turushka, and Yavana can mean Greek and does continue to be used in that sense in certain places, right? So all of them can mean Muslim, but not specifically so.
Even before the Muslim context, we can find the Militias as a term used for Greeks, Scythians, or anybody who is coming from outside, who is not the part of this stratified Brahmanical order, or we say the society that existed in that times. That's order of Brahman, Kshatriya, and all that. So anybody coming from outside, maybe from steppes of Central Asia, Scythians, or pre-Islamic invaders are considered as Militias. Maybe Greeks also.
Correct. And I think that the use of Malaysia, it ends up being used in kind of two ways. I think the kind of original impetus behind it being applied to Muslims had to do with this sort of ongoing concern that was by no means limited to Muslims, but basically with any outsider group, as you say, coming in and disturbing Brahmanical purity, right? There was this huge interest in sort of purity and sacrifice culture and purity culture on the part of Brahmins specifically. And so literally anybody who was not on board with that, their very, very specific cultural, sort of thing could be dubbed a Malaysia. And the list of people dubbed a Malaysia is like longer than my arm throughout prehistory, right? That said, it does become over time, within a few hundred years, I would say, a standard term, right? And then, especially in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, you really see it used without prejudice. And this
Without
is where you
prejudice.
really have to sort of closely read individual texts, because it really depends on the writer and sort of how they're talking about, whatever specific group of Muslims with political power that they're discussing. But you do see instances where Malaysia doesn't mean anything bad. It just means Muslim.
Yeah, just mean Muslims by
Right, like
16 and
without
17.
prejudice of any sort.
And you also reviewed on your basis and from the literature what you got it during this research, you counteracted the term used by Leonard Wender. He proposed that during 8th century they found in the Sanskrit account term Musalmana, and though some accounts refuted this Musalmana terms was not exactly in that place as it used to be proposed by many colonial historians or other historians of their time. Exactly.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. I'm saying that the term exactly 8th century, when we go in the 8th century Sanskrit account, did we find the term Musalmana in the context as it used to be proposed in some of the accounts?
So I was convinced by the argument on that. And as always, if people have differing views, welcome to the world of scholarship. We love disagreement, as long as it's civil and based on real arguments. I was convinced by the argument presented for that. So I presented in my book as there was a single use of Musalmana in Sanskrit in, right around 700 CE, but then it doesn't come back. Right, and it doesn't appear again. But one thing that early usage sort of allows us to do is it allows us to meaningfully pose the question: why didn't anyone use Musalmana or some other specifically religious term for Muslims for hundreds of more years in Sanskrit? Because without that term, without that single use in 700, that question is less powerful. Right? Like maybe it just didn't occur to anyone, like who knows? But this shows that it did occur to at least one person who was working in Sanskrit. And so I think it allows us to just put a little bit more pressure behind that question and make at least a slightly more forceful argument about how religious identity was not the primary one that Sanskrit intellectuals were thinking about.
So exactly as we move on in the book, we saw that by the start of the 11th century, because the first chapter has been mainly scanty accounts have been available for that. But when we move on to the 11th century, we saw that influx is coming up with the different shapes. Invaders are there, traders are there, migrants are there. And likewise, you see now specificity in the accounts came up, like you mentioned one of the Kadamba rulers who mentioned a trading family. So this is strange. Trading family also is in the, you talk in detail about that. Taikia family, I think. Taikia or Tekia family. That's mainly coming as a traders in the Gujarat, and it is found in one of the plates. So specifically now details start reflecting in that accounts. And as we move to the Buddhist accounts or Buddhist perspectives, what did you think that how they draw the comparison? Very interesting comparison you made that Buddhists concluded exactly for Muslims and Kshatriyas. So this is now a different perspective when we see this century. This is really interesting.
That's a fun bit. So for the Buddhist materials, I'm working with the Kala Chakra materials, which that's going to make perfect sense to any Buddhologists who are listening. Like this stuff appears, as far as I can tell, like pretty well known in Buddhist circles. But my Buddhist friends, this stuff is not well known beyond Buddhology. This was like news to me, all this Kala Chakra stuff. And this is a moment in the 11th century. It's really the only substantial moment I found where religious identity does appear to be on the table, specifically for this Buddhist tradition. And they appear very interested in what Muslims believed and what they did that made them Muslim. And we get a lot of specificity, about everything from periodic fasting to prayers to
sacrifices.
Right, all this sort of stuff. But keep in mind, this is from a Buddhist perspective. And the Kala Chakra tradition, basically the tradition uses Islam as a foil for itself, right? So the Kala Chakra tradition is trying to explain, why do we need a new Buddhist tradition at this particular moment? And the answer, one of their answers at least, is that Islam is on the scene. And we need to stop all these people from becoming Muslim and try to get them on the correct path, which is, of course, the Kala Chakra Buddhist path. And part of what they argue, and I did not, I was surprised at so many moments researching this book. This was one of them. They argue that people who do Vedic sacrifices, right? So especially, it seems like both Brahmins and Kshatriyas really are on the fast track to becoming Muslim because everybody involved is killing animals, right? Because keep in mind, Vedic sacrifices involve animal slaughter. And this is obviously coming from a Buddhist perspective of preferring, pacifism and nonviolence. And this is an old argument that Buddhists, clobbered everybody else with. Like, everybody else is killing animals, and we're not doing that. We're far more enlightened. But I think reading it through modern eyes, this is pretty striking, right?
Yeah,
There's no opposition there between Hinduism and Islam. It's rather that Hindus are about to become Muslims super fast, so y'all better become Buddhists, right?
Yeah. So this is a very interesting comparison. And on the other hand, at the same time, you draw that there is a paucity of literature written by the Brahmins. Brahmins are not mentioning about the Gauri Mahmud of Ghazni raids, and they are not talking about, there is a silence from the side of the Brahmins. They are not talking in much detail about the invasions of Ghazni, Mahmud of Ghazni, and they are not talking about the raids in detail. And this silence was continued for coming centuries also.
Yeah, Brahmins aren't talking about that at all.
No, they are not talking at all.
Yeah, so, and it is hard to know in history what to do with a silence. But in this case, given that Brahmins are writing about a whole lot of other stuff, including political events and including Muslims, I think it's fair to at least speculate, based on the available evidence, that it just wasn't that big of a deal to them. And
so,
for those who are familiar with colonial historiography, that's when the Ghaznavid raids really become this sort of huge thing, and the sort of beginning point of centuries of slavery and all of that modern nonsense. So really, it probably shouldn't be that surprising to us that at the time, maybe they just didn't even perceive that much difference. The Ghaznavids didn't invent the idea of sacking temples, right? They were not the first people to do that in India.
Yeah, exactly. Still some neighbor kings, maybe co-religionists or following the same religion, and they are also using the same thing. So they didn't find it something strange. Maybe only they are outsiders. This is a difference. Means coming outside the subcontinent. This is the only difference.
Right. And it's hard to know without further evidence. Did they really perceive that as different? Did they think about the subcontinent in the same way that we do? There are textualized representations of India that go pretty far back, but that's hardly evidence that everyone thought about it that way.
Exactly. Now coming to your next chapter, where you talk about in detail about now the role of Prithviraj came up, and Prithviraj accounts from the Jayankas. That is one of the most, I think, important treatises that you reviewed for your book. But here also, we didn't find the same binary, Hindu versus Muslims. In fact, Ghurids, they are quite critical. They consider it as enemies. But again, he tried to present him from their own perspective of religion. He sometimes tell him as outcasted, sometimes as a low-born caste, sometimes like framing it from their own idea, but still the same idea didn't came up. It was like a fight for the power, fight for the region, and somebody coming from outside, so they are like outcast. So this perspective is also very interesting.
Absolutely. And I think Jayanaka's Prithviraja Vijaya is definitely the harshest case of othering that I present and deal with in the book. Yeah. Like, he hated the Ghurids. There's no doubt about that. There is nothing he likes about this group of people. But to put it very succinctly, in terms of religion, he cared about Brahmins, not Muslims, right? Like, the problem was not that the Ghurids were Muslims. The problem was that he was a Brahmin, and his position was much more assured under a Kshatriya ruler than it could have been under the Ghurids. What else do I want to say? One note is that I do use the language of invaders in that chapter. And I want to be clear, the Ghurids didn't invade India. There was no India politically to invade. That makes absolutely no sense. There was no India. Exactly. There was just no political unity. They invaded the Chohan kingdom, which was based in Ajmer, not in Delhi. If you think the Chohans are based in Delhi, that's a later invention.
Exactly.
Anyways,
that's a later thing.
And I think that is sort of one sort of point that I try to do in the book. Many of the early texts I deal with, from Jayanaka's text onwards, are texts of extreme violence, of one dynasty annihilating another dynasty. They center around battles. There's a lot of bloodshed, which makes beautiful Sanskrit poetry. That's part of Sanskrit aesthetics. And I try to offer frameworks for dealing with that. Right? People sometimes accuse historians of sort of, glossing over the violence of the past. And we don't. right? We have a different way of dealing with it that does not prioritize how you feel about it today, right? That does not sort of prioritize a kind of modern emotional stance.
So this is how, as we move on to the next century, we found now there is an exchange of the words in the Sanskrit. So it's like Sanskrit becoming more porous. As you say, this language has not imbibed the foreign words. Otherwise, there should be a larger context behind it. Like one of the two common words I would like to quote here, Hamira. Hamira and Suratrana. So what we like to pronounce it, I'm not related in Sanskrit, so maybe Suratrana, maybe you'll pronounce better than me. And Hamira, I think I'm pronouncing it correctly. These are the two words that you think that are derived from the Sultan and Amirs. So Persian and Arabic words are imbibing inside the Sanskrit, and we saw that these terms are used now in the later centuries for the Hindu kings, Muslim kings, and this is a common coinage.
Correct.
And even on the coins of Iltutmish, Suratna Sirsam Sadina, he used to use these words of the Sanskrit on his coins.
Absolutely. And Suratrana is very nice. It also has a sort of meaning in Sanskrit, right? So, sort of protector, protected by the gods. If you're more familiar with South India Sanskrit text, it appears with an L there, Sulatrana. I deal with both. And one interesting thing about both of these terms is, as you say, they're imported into Sanskrit. They're used for Muslim rulers, but they're also used for Hindu rulers, right? Like pretty soon thereafter. And so when I try, and I do in a couple of pages, I try to sort of get at like why use new terms? Again, there are dozens of Sanskrit words for king. Like we did not need new Sanskrit words for king, trust me. And so why coin them? There had to be some context, some reason for that, but there clearly is not some religious litmus test. It's not like it marks somebody who is sort of not part of the Varna system or is not Kshatriya, because they're also using this stuff. And so I think what the sort of unique content is a way of expressing sovereignty. The Indo-Persian tradition has an entirely different way of thinking about sovereignty, and that developed distinctly, right, at least up until roughly this point in history, from the Sanskrit-based tradition. And if there's one thing that Sanskrit intellectuals sort of generally and across the board were pretty interested in, it was ways to express political power, right? That is a very consistent and recurring interest among that crowd. So maybe they were interested in what the Indo-Persian tradition had to say and could offer on that front.
Or we can say that Indo-Persian traditions find its place now in the new order.
Absolutely. And I mean, in terms of sort of hard political power, I mean, they sort of forced their way in. So what are you going to do? But also in sort of the representations in 14th century Sanskrit text, whereas for Vijayanagara, the Ghurids were they were irremediably different. He couldn't see them as incorporated into the world of Indian kingship. And less than 200 years later, really just 100 some years later, it's fine. Like they're on the scene. People like Ganga Devi and Naya Chandra, who are writing in the 14th century, don't have a particular issue with this. They fight against some of these kings, but in terms of admitting them as rulers in India, including all the way down in Tamil Nadu, that is not a problem.
That is not a problem. If you allow me, I would like to read for our audiences one of the few lines from your page number 90, where you talk exactly how amalgamation was taking place. And then we will move on, just like a reading to this already diverse universe. Exactly, the words are really very heavy here. Indo-Muslim kings added their own robust ruling cultures, complete with the new languages, norms of compartments, battle strategies, legitimation needs, patronage practices, and building campaigns, and more. And this is the way how we find the coins of Iltutmish and later Sultanate era kings with the titles of Sanskrit Sultana and their own names in the Sanskrit version, like Sri Samsadina or other names of the other later on monarchs, with the Sanskrit version is also there. So this is just like a new build-up of the Indo-Muslim kings of their own culture, as Audrey has explained it in detail little. So do you want to comment anything, or we'll move on?
I can rest on what I've written on that. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. So now we will see that Jain traders came up here, and even the description of mosque came in. First time we saw that in Sanskrit literature there is a description of mosque, and not only description of mosque, but we will see that some of the Jain traders are financing the building of mosque. This is now a new era of adaptability, and I could say like syncretic fusion or bridging of two different cultures. Even on the coastal lands of Gujarat, where there was a lot of business, people from different ethnicities, Muslims and others, are usually having an influx even before the Islamic invasions.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
So,
and I think we look back at it today, and it's noteworthy, which is why I mention it in the book, right? So you have a Jain guy who is sponsoring both Hindu temples and Muslim mosques, but we're all surprised by the second part, and we're not surprised by the first part, right? Yeah. And the problem there, I think, is with us. I think this was probably far less surprising in pre-modernity.
Exactly. Audrey, there is a lot of questions coming in. Should we take it at the end, or I can take it in between? What do you prefer?
That's really as you like. I love questions.
Okay,
I don't want to interrupt your mojo. So you.
No, that's good. That's good. So let me display it here. Did you find any basis of our modern dichotomy of broad-based religious identities of those Sanskrit texts?
The short answer is no. I found very limited instances where certain things come up. So we talked about the Kala Chakra works. I mean, that's, 1,000 years ago now. And that's a tradition that did not continue to find expression in Sanskrit-based texts in India. Later in the book, I do deal with the appearance of the term Hindu, okay, which is not a Sanskrit word. That is a Persian term that is imported into Sanskrit far later. And its first usage by a quote Hindu king is for him to say he's not a Hindu, right? Which is interesting. He says he's a sultan over Hindu kings, which he presents as lesser than him. But one point that I make, especially for later uses of the word Hindu, so 17th, 18th century Sanskrit text, it often means upper caste Hindu, right? Often specifically Brahmins and Kshatriyas. So broad-based, not broad-based, much more narrow.
So definitely it is more on Kshatriya and their own orders rather than Hindu or Muslim. This was a point that we start from the very start of the book. It's articulate in that manner. So let us now move on to Ganga Devi's account of Khiljis and Tughlaqs, how she find this campaign. And this is very interesting. And this is the only lady you find it in your entire dozen of Sanskrit elite literates who wrote a lot about the poetries and histories of that time. Mm-hmm. So how did Ganga Devi reflected on Khiljis and Tughlaq invasion? We can reflect it in a very brief manner that what was her perspective of finding these two invaders in the south of India, especially on Madurai campaigns?
Right. So Ganga Devi, her sort of main topic, she is writing about the Vijayanagara takeover of the Sultanate of Madurai. Okay, the Sultanate of Madurai was an independent Muslim-led kingdom in Tamil Nadu. It lasted almost 40 years before Vijayanagara decimated it. And that sultanate was founded in the aftermath of the Khalji and Tughlaq campaigns down south. And what I find, I think it's one of the better examples in the book of how I read history through poetic tropes and as expressed in poetic tropes. And I want to highlight for people that I am diverging from a significant amount of thought among modern Sanskritists on this. Many modern Sanskritists are on record saying, oh, this is just a literary convention. It's just a poetic trope. So you can't read historical specificity in that because it's just a trope. And I see this differently. I think that Sanskrit has, and I guess still had and still has, one of the most robust set of literary conventions and tropes known to humankind, right? Like a pre-modern Sanskrit intellectual always had lots of tropes and conventions to choose from. And so I think we can and should ask, why did he, or in this case, she, choose this trope? Why this one? Why not the dozens of other options? And I think you can see historical specificity expressed in that. And so while Ganga Devi, she never explicitly says anything about the Khalji and Tughlaq campaigns, not using the names of the dynasties, but there is a section, I think it's chapter 8, where I sort of read a series of verses and she's talking about fallen temples and the temple at Srirangam. And I am able to tie that to specific historical events and dates that we know from Indo-Persian sources. And so it's beautiful poetry, right? She was a great Sanskrit poet in my estimation. But it is a way of expressing a sort of set of historical events that I think readers of the time would have recognized and that we can recognize today if we are trained in both Sanskrit literature and Indo-Muslim history.
So thank you, Audrey, because we are running also time, and your book is really a very, very great work. So I cannot discuss in such a detail, but hopefully we can give the glimpses to the audiences. I will go to Hamira Mahakavya. That I have something interesting to pick out. It is a very lengthy chapter and you have to read in the detail. But in Hamira is actually, this is a Mahakavya, I could like to say. It's like an epic which talk about the Chauhan's expedition against the Muslim armies or Sultan's armies. But especially here you find 4 Muslim commanders. And the epic move around Mahima Shahi. Mahima Shahi is a Muhammad Shah who probably seems to be a Mongol Muslims and joined by the side of this Chauhan army until the last moment. There is many legends associated with him, killing his own family and all these things. So a little bit reflection on this. You find that this is very surprising for today modern readers when they read a lot of fake history, a lot of propagandas. So you will find that Chauhan is allied with a Muslim Mongol and he's fighting with the Sultan and is taking a vows for giving the life and even sacrificing their family members.
No, absolutely. So the text concerns the 1301 Khalji assault on Ranthambore fort and the death of Hamira Chauhan, the sort of last in that Chauhan line in battle. And Nayan Chandra is writing more than a century later, and he's not writing for a Chauhan. So that's sort of interesting. I sort of speculate that he's trying to get at something broader, not just writing about one specific dynasty, but exactly what broader and what he was conceptualizing, that I'm less clear on. And he tells this very interesting story where Hamira Chauhan is betrayed by all of his Hindu commanders, all of the top people, except his own brother. All right, his own brother sticks around.
Exactly.
So they all go over to Alauddin Khalji's side and are depicted just, as terrible people and, so on and so forth. But there are these 4 sort of Mongol guys, and Mahima Sahi, all right, Muhammad Shah would have been his sort of Perso-Arabic name, is one of them. And they are loyal to Hamira Chauhan to the death. And not only that, but it appears that Mahima Sahi actually dies after Hamira Chauhan. And that it's sort of hidden in the last chapter of the text. It is an obscure 2 verses. So, whether I got that exactly right, I leave that for future Sanskritists to have fun with. But I think that there is a sort of valorization, not just of Hamira Chauhan, who that's all totally normal, like fallen hero. Sanskrit authors have been writing about that for a long, long time. But there's also this valorization of someone who, because he was a Mongol and because he was an outsider, he could sort of affirmatively choose Kshatriya culture, right? And that's valuable because Hamira Chauhan couldn't choose, right? He was born a Kshatriya, he was a Kshatriya king. Like there's nothing he could do about his identity. But Mahima Sahi changed his, right? So it shows fluidity, but in a way that sort of embraces and I think invigorates and gives new life to Kshatriya culture, which was presumably facing some pressure given accelerating Indo-Persian rule in this period.
And as we move on, we saw that now the new terms are more inclusive, even the talk of Makkah. That is really interesting for me, the term in the Sanskrit like Mak Tirth Yatra or something like that. Mak Tirth Yatra, I can say. This is specifically the pilgrimage to Makkah, what the Muslims used to say for the Hajj, I think. So this Tirth Yatra, and especially associated with Mak, so Mak Tirth Yatra, there has been a mention of pilgrims of Muslims going to Makkah. So little bit they are now talking about Islamic philosophy rather than when we go to the Buddhist account, they talk in more detail. But here now they are touching it. And especially now moving to the Kashmiri's account, we have a lot of accounts. Then we deal about it in description, Mir Shahi dynasty and all that. When we talk about, you talk about the local and regional influences, one in Gujarat and one in Kashmir. And you saw in Kashmir, there is a lot of accounts about the Muslim kings now. This is for the first time, I think, in the local culture. There is a eulogizing for Muslim kings and finding their genealogical accounts to their own gods.
Absolutely. So the Kashmiri texts are, in a sense, the best known ones. Kalhana's Raja Charangini is often held up as the unicorn book of history, right? The one Sanskrit guy in pre-modernity who managed to write a history. And I deal with Kalhana in the book, but I situate him crucially within a tradition of Kashmiri history writing, right? So if you're looking for Kalhana as like the one super innovative guy who broke the tradition's mold, you probably want to read another book. And I spend more time on Kalhana's 2 successors, Jonaraja and Shrivada, who both wrote Raja Charanginis, so same title for 3 texts, and there are
3
more.
texts.
Yeah, so it gets a little confusing. But also, they wrote their Rajataranginis for the Shahmiris. So these are court-sponsored texts in addition to being Sanskrit histories. And you're right, we do get more cultural specificity. As time goes on, we just generally get more about Muslims and Muslim practice that appears in these texts. But still, especially for Jonaraja and Srivara, they were way more concerned about Brahmanical privilege. I mean, if you really want like a poster boy for concern about Brahmanical hegemony and maintaining it, like these 2 men are your poster boys. So that's really their overarching concern.
So even just to add it, I don't know whether in your research you find it out, because there are 100 of the accounts that goes unnoticed, maybe the local one. Jawaharlal Nehru's great-great-grandfathers, who used to mention in his own biography, Raj Kaul, he was invited by Farrukh Siyar. He was from Kashmir and he was a Pandit of Sanskrit and also a Persian scholar. He was invited to a Mughal court. And this is how Kaul get a big grant near Delhi, near the Nehar or a canal. So this is how the name Nehru have been derived from. Kaul's change it to Nehru.
Oh, it's interesting.
So
I don't think I knew
this
that.
is interesting account. Jawaharlal Nehru himself wrote in his own account, I think an autobiography, and recently Shashi Tharoor also cited in his book.
Very interesting, very interesting.
So this is interesting account, and we can say the evidence-based account. We see the first Prime Minister of India tracing its descendants from a literate Kashmiri Sanskrit speaking and a scholarly family. And getting grants from
Kashmir had a very long tradition of Sanskrit intellectual production, stretching well into the 19th century.
And now we see very interesting. I think some of the audiences have put the question: the Shivaji, now Marathas having a role. So their perspectives in Sanskrit historian. This is again a very big field where you talk about in much details about the Bhosles in 2 or 3 slots.
Right. So, okay. So the Bhonsle family, Shivaji and some of his successors and some of his like offshoots as well, people like Ekoji down in Thanjavur, they sponsor a whole series of Sanskrit historical works. Arguably one of the bigger sets, sort of, if you put it all together. And again, this is an area where I don't think I did justice. There's just so much material. I mean, what to say about this? So a couple of interesting notes. One, he's not Shivaji in these texts. He's just Shiva. All right. Shiva. So for anyone who wants to get mad at me, like get mad at Shivaji's, historians instead. They're the ones who just came up with like Shiva straight up. Also, one interesting thing is that they're still sort of trying out vocabulary terms, right? So they sort of they adapt Uzbek as a term, Ujabaka and things like that. So it actually gave me solace in a sense, because we still struggle today with what to call Indo-Persian rule: Indo-Persian, Indo-Muslim, Indo-Islamic, Islamicate, Persian, Persianate. Like there's just like this plethora of modern scholarly terms. And so I took a lot of heart in the fact that pre-modern thinkers had vocabulary problems too. Like almost 5 centuries into Indo-Persian rule or whatever we call it, they still didn't know what to call it either. They were still actively thinking about it. But yeah, I mean, I guess maybe one final point to make is, with Shivaji, people think sometimes of this like, Hindu hero who, is sort of like instituting some kind of prototype Hindu nationalism.
Larger Indian nationalism and finding out of independent India, something like that in today's perception.
Yeah, let me say this very clearly. That is wrong, right? That is completely historically inaccurate. That's not who Shiva was, okay? That's not what he was trying to do. And, you can say and think and believe whatever you want about him today, obviously, but you're wrong, historically speaking. And in his Sanskrit text, what the Sanskrit text that he sponsored, what comes out are other sorts of concerns. He was very interested in the approval of Brahmins, and that no doubt stemmed from his sort of uncertain and problematic caste status, right? He was born a Shudra. He tried to become a Kshatriya, which you cannot really do. So he had to have a ceremony invented. He paid very well for that, to sort of recover his caste. And I know that this is a very sensitive issue today, Shivaji's caste status. The only thing I can say 2 things. One, it was sensitive in his time as well, which is why he put so much time and effort into trying to, sort of create a certain kind of image for himself. But also, to return to an earlier point I made, there is so much more to think and know about the Indian past than whether you're offended by it, right? So my advice is sort of twofold. For people who just really can't stomach a frank discussion of the past, like stop listening to historians like me, like go do something else with your time. And for those who thirst for a different view and want to actually know about the past, you have to hold in check your modern inclinations to be offended, right? Just because we're interested in the past and just because we want to know about it doesn't mean we endorse it, okay? But in pursuit of scholarly knowledge, you have to hold back your modern biases.
Exactly. And some questions are coming in the context. Let me say that how this book guides us in ongoing debates today in India against the nationalist claims that are mostly grounded in fabricated vision of India's pre-modernity. So I think Audrey has answered many times during our talk. And,
yeah, I mean, I would just say generally, if there's sort of one thing that my book might offer that maybe not all books offer, I go lighter on piercing holes in sort of modern problems. What I go heavy on is giving you a lot of meat and substance about what did views of the other and what did identity look like in pre-modernity, right? Because I think honestly, it's a little easier to say that our modern identities haven't always existed as such. Right? Historians say that all the time, and we should, and I will continue to repeat that ad nauseum, I have no doubt. But so what did identity look like in pre-modernity, right? If it wasn't Hindu versus Muslim, what was it? Who was opposed to who and who was not opposed to who? And for example, my book offers plenty of examples of conflict between specific named political dynasties, especially, right? So I offer you not only that what we think of today has not always existed, but I tried to describe some of what did exist, at least through the eyes of one particular group, namely elite Sanskrit intellectuals.
Exactly. This is one of the perspective among the literary circles of that time. At least we can able to see what they have wrote it. Ali Heather has a question, and I think we have a complete chapter of Mughal Empire related to Sanskrit. Maybe it is related to that. Nayaks of Madurai were tributaries of Mughal Empire. So why the southernmost Tamil Nadu is not shown in a map of Mughal Empire? I think this question is something a little bit out from the context of our book. Maybe, but because book is talking more about the perspectives, I think. What order you need to say for this question?
Yeah, absolutely. The book is really much more intellectual history. It's an intellectual history of how people thought about politics. But let me just say, I've never faced an objection before that I'm downplaying the Mughal Empire. So thank you for a new objection to my work.
Yeah. So I think this is not an objection, just a query, I think. Shahu was released by Mughals with the promise that he will remain alive. How Sanskrit narratives? There is a complete chapter about a Sanskrit narrative for the Marathas. You can read in that chapter. The chapter mainly talking about Marathas. Audrey can shed more light. Confusion between identifying Muslims and Rajputs. This is quite elaborated there. They don't find Rajputs sometimes as a Hindus even. They don't know that Rajputs, for them, they are fighting were really a Hindus or the allies of Malachas, or sometimes Malachas themselves. So this is some confusing coinage between North India and Marathas. That's, as you said, that this is not about a larger identity of the nation. It's about their regional powers.
No, absolutely. And again, that was a surprising thing to me. I mean, you would think of all things in the late 17th century that I thought I knew what Rajput meant, but then reading some of these Sanskrit texts, it didn't mean quite what I thought it meant. Not to them.
So quickly, Audrey, we can just talk about few reflections from the Mughal part, because this is a big chapter and I missed it in the talk. We cannot cover everything. So this is a huge chapter, just a little bits from that Mughal part of the Sanskrit, actually.
So, like you're thinking specifically of sort of the Jain accounts there, or
yes, simply
later...
what was happening exactly in the Mughal court regarding. You have a separate book for that, but here you have a complete chapter, I think, before the Marathas.
Right. And in a sense, this is a set of roughly 6 Jain-authored accounts that talk about the Mughals in some depth. And some of the Jain intellectuals who wrote these texts were at the Mughal court. Others were sort of connected to and knew other Jain monks who were at the Mughal court. And I should mention that body of materials is actually what first sparked my interest in this project, because it was really the number of texts, that there are 6 to 8, kind of depending on how you count. And I thought, wow, if I have this for 70 years in one court, I wonder what else is out there. As it turns out, quite a bit. These are Jains. They're writing about sort of the Mughals and what's going on there. And there's a variety of views. I think one of the more interesting ones is there's one guy, Padmasagara, who rewrites early Mughal history. And he sort of
And
he takes Babur out, and then he shortens the timeline. For those of you who know Mughal history, it was kind of a rough start, right? Like we almost didn't have an empire. Humayun's main thing he's known for is getting kicked out of his empire and losing it.
Suri period has been excluded.
Right.
Afghan Suris has been excluded, and Badakhshan was a part of India, something like that.
Yeah, so it's a much more streamlined version of the early Mughal Empire. And what I take away from that, one thing I take away is a couple of things, I guess. Padmasagara wanted a strong Mughal Empire, so he wrote it that way. And he also felt at liberty to rewrite this. And there that's a good example to see that what was history for pre-modern Sanskrit intellectuals, it's not what we would dub history today. And that's okay, right? There's no pre-modern history text, even in Western traditions, that we're going to identify as clear history today. And I think the differences of recognizing and working through those can be to our benefit.
Something interesting, as a medical doctor from my background, so reading the appendix, I found the Hamilton's treatment of hemorrhoids have been explicitly described like a curse, and it happens due to something for this and treatment. This is really interesting and funny translation of the Sanskrit, how it is presented in the accounts, actually.
I'm glad you bring that up. I should have consulted with you on that. So I consulted with a medical doctor who practices, and I consulted with 2 historians of medicine to figure out what was going on. Because that was really shocking. I mean, I'm just reading this early 18th century Sanskrit text. It's about Mughal intrigues in the 1710s, which there were a lot of Mughal intrigues in that particular decade. And so, you're just reading along and so-and-so's plotting against so-and-so and, poison and normal stuff. And then all of a sudden, it's someone's cutting the king's hemorrhoids. And it's what? What is going on here? And it is a very explicit account. It is one example, there's a lot of things to say about this. But one is that this is a case where the Sanskrit tradition gives more specificity than other historical traditions. The Farrukh Siyar's hemorrhoids are noted in European texts of the period, and they're noted in Persian texts as well, but both of those are much more obscure. No one felt that it was a great idea to write in great detail. Whereas here we have the medical procedure of cutting followed by impotence and all this stuff described in sort of excruciating detail. So there, I do not argue that the main value of these texts is to offer further details on politics of the period. I don't think that's their primary value, but I think that they can be used for that at times. And this is one example of that. Not to mention it's intrinsically interesting.
Audrey, I think we can conclude the session. There are some feedback and some comments. Leher Zedi from UK says that, hello, ma'am. Nice to see you. Your book, Cultural Encounters, was one of my favorite books. It seems we are living in a post-18th view of things. Would you say this vision has impacted our current perceptions?
Yes, I would say so. And I would say 2 things. I think that if you want to know where does this idea of Hindu-Muslim division come from and communal violence, I think you have to date that back to the colonial period. So if you're looking for the sort of social and intellectual genealogy, you want to go back. That said, this is the second thing I would say, the British aren't around in India anymore, right? Colonialism has been gone for over 70 years. And so if you are looking for who is maintaining this today and who is responsible for it, the blame for this no longer rests on British shoulders, right? The blame for this in the modern day rests on modern actors within India, and they should be held accountable for it.
Exactly. What is Jyotirumo Jishnu? I missed a little bit, but there is anything written on Mughal women in Sanskrit account of Mughals, considering the fact that women are more protected and restricted access?
Well, okay, so I would contest that point as a point of hard history. I mean, were Mughal women really restricted? I mean, Noor Jahan was a crack shot. Gulbadan Begum leads a multi-year all-women's trip to go on Hajj in Mecca. Women writing stuff. Jahanara goes to Ajmer to go to the shrine of Muinuddin Chishti. I mean, so maybe check some of your modern assumptions there. I would say women do not come up much, if at all, in my discussion of the Jain authored Mughal accounts, but there are women periodically throughout the book.
Exactly. Just one question, I think, concluding statements. A lot of Sanskrit account, we found that at least what happening with the Sufism in all these centuries is missing in all these accounts, because I think they are not bothering about the religion itself. So that's why this part was largely missed. But from the Bengal, you show the different picture. This is, I
Absolutely.
think, something giving connect to that part that is missing in the other accounts.
Absolutely. And that's a great place to end. That's where I end the book in part. So about halfway through my research, I noticed that I had nothing from Bengal. And I thought that was weird. So I set out to find it, right? When you have a hole in your research, you try to fill that gap. And so I looked long and hard for any works from Bengal that would sort of qualify as Sanskrit histories that dealt with political figures. And I should mention, we have Indo-Persian rule relatively early in Bengal. So like I would have expected text from there, and I found bupkis. Like I found absolutely nothing. And so what I did find were, especially this one later text that I mentioned, that it's not history. It's much more of a fanciful story, but it deals with specifically the spread of Islam throughout Bengal. Upon further reflection, basically what I end up sort of promoting as a theory in the book, and just a reminder, historians do have varying degrees of belief in our own theories. So I promote this as a theory, this is not one that I'm more sort of attached to, as I'm certainly right. But my current theory is that Islam, as we all know, spread throughout Bengal much more quickly and permeated more deeply in society than elsewhere in India, right? It's a sort of unique and special story. And so I think that because of that, Bengalis, that's the story that they were interested in. They were less interested in exploring Indo-Persian rule in Sanskrit, which people in the rest of India were interested in. They were more interested in their religiously focused story. And they seemed to find that appropriate to investigate through non-historical texts. And so it's, at the end of the day, it looks like a gap to me in my research, but it wasn't a gap. It was just a different focus.
Just a different perspective, I think. Anushka Rajput, just last, I think, I did my research paper in Sufism and covered Rabiul Adivya. Is there in Bibi Fatima? Maybe I think this is a different topic. We can
a little bit
discuss
different. That's a very specific question.
Yeah, a specific question. So Audrey, we don't want to add anything. We covered a lot of questions from audiences also. And I think this was a great talk and great pleasure for me to host this session and have a lot of learning. Especially, I'm a history lover. I'm not a history scholar, but definitely it's a great learning for me.
No, thank you very much for hosting me. And I loved your questions. You obviously read the book carefully. And that's what every scholar dreams of, is to have such an engaged reader. So thank you.